Thank you for joining us. I'm Jamie Gass, Director of Pioneer Education. Welcome to our webinar, What the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists Can Teach Us Today. As many know, the Federalist Papers is a collection of 85 articles and essays written between October 1887 and May 1888 by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They used the Roman pseudonym Publius to promote the ratification of the Constitution of the United States in the pivotal state of New York. In 2005, Alexander Hamilton's biographer, Ron Chernow, reminded us of the brilliance of the 30-year-old wonder boy of the founding era. Quote, "It is Hamilton who dreams up and then supervises the most influential defense of the Constitution ever written, the Federalist Papers. Of those 85 essays, Hamilton manages to draft an astonishing 51 of them. No less astonishing, there are periods where he's publishing them at a rate of 5 or 6 a week. No less astonishing, he's doing it as a sideline. He had a full-time legal practice. In fact, we have anecdotal evidence of the printer sitting in the outer office as Hamilton scribbles the final lines of an essay. No single treatise on the Constitution has been cited more frequently than the Federalist Papers by the U.S. Supreme Court. All citizens and students in particular should know far more about these important, enduring sources of American political philosophy, proving once again that the winners usually get most of the credit and press from historians. The anti-federalists have seemingly slid into virtual obscurity, but they should not. After all, as Publius, neither Hamilton nor the man who ultimately drafted the U.S. Bill of Rights, James Madison, actually supported a Bill of Rights during the Constitutional Convention or the state ratification process. Hamilton in particular wrote that a Bill of Rights was both unnecessary and actually dangerous. That is, the fact that we have a Bill of Rights is largely due to the anti-federalists like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Samuel Adams. Thank goodness these anti-federalists, many of whom were themselves heroes from the revolutionary generation, had the wisdom, fortitude, and persuasiveness to make the case for our Bill of Rights. The U.S. Constitution, like every state constitution, would be unimaginable without one. In addition to their fears about a new national constitution not having a Bill of Rights, the anti-federalists were concerned that the Constitution as written would be oppressive to the people. They worried that the president would become like a king. They thought the federal judiciary would become too powerful, and that the national government would turn the states into administrative provinces. Of course, these are arguments that have echoed across U.S. history from the 18th century to the Civil War, to two world wars, the Cold War, the Civil Rights era, and right up to our time. The key features of these debates found in the exchanges between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are absolutely foundational to understanding the rule of law in our democratic society. They contain basic elements about the nature of political power and rights, representative government, the separation of powers, federalism, and limited government that are fundamental to understanding our republic. Knowledge of all of this prepares anyone for civic education and life in a healthy, functioning, free society. Our world could certainly use more of that these days. That's why today we're particularly happy to be working with these very talented teachers to help explain and expand our knowledge of the topic. These are educators who communicate these enduring democratic ideals to our young people every day. With us this afternoon, we're grateful to host Kelley Brown, a social studies and government teacher at East Hampton High School, former Massachusetts Teacher of the Year, and the driving force behind the We the People Contest 2020 National Civics Champions. Timothy Moore, co-editor and Deputy Director of Outreach and Professional Development at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. Chris Cavanaugh, social studies teacher at Bismarck High School, North Dakota. Shayne Klein, an academic dean and history teacher at Raleigh Charter High School in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Stacey Sklar, an English and We the People teacher at Amador Valley High School, California. We're honored to begin with Kelley Brown discussing the Federalists and Anti-Federalists.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm very excited to be with you all today. I'm excited to give a brief introduction to an amazing panel that's going to speak with you after this. I do like to always say at the beginning of this that I am a history teacher. I'm not a historian. And so a lot of the work that I'll talk about today luckily, as a history teacher, I get a lot of support from historians and folks that are out there helping history teachers learn more. So it's very exciting to be with you today. I wanted to start actually just with a brief story to say that at the end of my summer, I had about a week left before the summer was about to end. And I thought I'd like to read something that will help me in the school year. And I had just done a summer program with Bob Allison, a history professor at Suffolk University here in Boston. And a few years ago, he had given me a collection, The Essential Debate on the Constitution, which is a collection of Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. And I thought to myself, I've never actually sat down and read a full collection of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. I certainly have read many, many, but usually it's more of like a hunting game. When I do that hunting game, certainly the Center for the Study of the American Constitution that Tim is here from is my go-to, incredibly helpful, but their collection is massive, and I wasn't about to try to read that. But I did decide I was going to read this 400 pages, this collection of Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. And what I found at the end was it left me with a lot of questions. It was incredibly helpful to sit down and do that. But also, I had questions like, why did they choose these documents? Some of them I had read before, some of them I hadn't. I had additional questions about the documents themselves, like how many times had these actually been printed? To what extent did they actually influence the ratification debates? What purpose should these serve in my classroom? And so that really, I think, gets me started in my charge today, which is to sort of introduce you to the ratification debates so that you can hear from this amazing panel. And I will give, at my best, some things for you to consider and maybe some questions to ask, and hopefully inspire you maybe to pick up a couple of these documents when this is over. So what I will briefly talk about in the next 15 minutes or so is just, how did we get to the point where there is a debate? Who were the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists? And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Anti-Federalists today. What kind of ideas united them? What were their major critiques of the US Constitution? And then kind of what I just said, which is, okay, what's the most important? What do we do with these things as teachers, as people, as citizens? Like, how do we potentially use these things? So I just want to briefly start for folks who maybe aren't as familiar or aren't, sitting around the week before school reading the 400 pages of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers for fun. Just to give you a little bit of context is how do we get to the Constitution? And one of the things that I think is really important to note is that many would argue that the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention maybe wasn't wholly necessary. We had a somewhat functioning form of government that was drafted during the American Revolution. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had 13 functioning state constitutions. And the choice to hold a convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was in many ways a choice. And so there were issues that were happening, and those issues, I think, were pressing enough that enough people were saying that something needed to happen. And some of those issues included things like debt that was accumulated during the Revolution, that the Congress was having trouble acquiring enough money to pay off that debt, both to individuals, to foreign countries, et cetera. Taxation was difficult. It was hard for Congress to get that money through taxation because they had to rely on the states to acquire that money directly from the people. And some of the states were having trouble actually keeping up with the taxes that were actually needed and putting in what they needed. And there's multiple reasons for that. The printing of paper money in states was also a major issue. And of course, there were foreign issues as well. And so I always like to say to my students, we've got paper money and we have pirates. There are problems with America being able to defend its merchant ships in the Mediterranean. And, there's just general issues with whether we were secure enough or whether the United States was secure enough at the time. And so issues of debt, taxation, paper money, pirates, all sort of bring us to Congress issuing or asking each state to send delegates to Pennsylvania in the summer of 1787. And all but one agree to send delegates. Rhode Island refuses, sends a letter, and explains why they're not going to. But Congress essentially charges this group with the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. There were several amendments, a trade amendment, a taxation amendment that much everybody knew needed to happen. But the problem under the Articles was that amendments needed to be approved unanimously by all the states. And so they had struggled with that. And so they're supposed to be making amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island makes that difficult if it's going to be unanimous because they decide not to show up. And New Hampshire shows up very late in the game. But that is their purpose. Additionally, when they arrive at the convention, they do set up some rules for the convention, including that there is going to be a secrecy rule. And Pierce Butler is really the one, according to the notes, who proposes this. And the purpose is to protect the convention from what he said, quote, licentious publication of their proceedings. And so therefore, it would allow the delegates to be more open to debate and sort of entertaining ideas if they kept it secret, right? They didn't allow this to leave. But what happens as a result of that is there is some suspicion, certainly, of what is happening there. And additionally, some delegates leave during the convention who also are incredibly suspicious of what's happening there, or they confirm the suspicions of what's actually happening. But on September 17th of 1787, what Congress will later call the report, which is the new Constitution, leaves the convention and is heading back to Congress and to eventually to the states under the Article 7 clause to be ratified by special conventions that are going to be organized by the state legislatures, but essentially allow the people to say yay or nay to this document that had just been created. And so in many ways, this is an incredibly democratic deed. This is going back to the people. And Madison himself says in 1796, in a completely different context, that this document, when it left Philadelphia in 1787, really was nothing more than a draft of a plan until the life and validity were breathed into it by the voice of the people. If we really want to know the meaning of this instrument behind, its face, we must look for it in the state conventions which accepted and ratified the Constitution. So this debate, this 11-month debate between what become known as this kind of bifurcated, anti-federalist, federalist idea, really give life, I think, to the ideas that were debated and that people were concerned about at the time. And according to Madison, really give voice to what this actual Constitution meant. So who were these folks, right? Who were the Federalists? Who were the Anti-Federalists? So the thing that is most clearly associated with the Federalists are the 85 essays known as the Federalist Papers. Proceeding here from right to left, John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton write these 85 essays as Publius, right? The author of the Federalist Papers is Publius, but is written by these folks. And they're writing between September and the fall of 1788. Several hundred pamphlets in general are going to come out with a Federalist persuasion. But the 85 essays known as the Federalist Papers are written by these three under the pseudonym Publius. Over 175,000 words written very quickly. And most of them are first drafts because the speed at which they have to actually produce them. And you begin to see Madison and Hamilton write the most. Madison's really focused on, if one were to generalize, maybe some of the bigger issues about representation and the principles of government and checks and balances and federalism. And Hamilton is a little bit more focused on the specific details, things like the executive branch, the judicial branch, et cetera, although they do mend with each other. But I think what it does allow is for their voices to both be heard without necessarily conflicting each other. Now, I put James Wilson up here on the left because in many ways, if we're looking at who actually is having the largest impact on the progress towards ratification, I think James Wilson can't be left out. His speeches that he gives in October and November are incredibly important. And just to also make the point that even though these are the Federalist Papers, that there are many Federalist writings that happened during this time that have a huge influence, and speeches, et cetera. So who are the Anti-Federalists? Well, the Anti-Federalists in many ways actually shape the debate. I actually find them way more interesting to explore. It's their concerns that prompt the topics that the Federalists cover in Publius. And, they're very fascinating to read. I think the trouble with the Anti-Federalists for not historians, but for history teachers, when we try to simplify things, is that this is an incredibly diverse group of folks. So I think they're not all opposed to the Constitution. They're diverse intellectually, geographically, economically. You have people that are outright rejecting the document. You also have people that want amendments, but aren't necessarily outright rejecting it. There are people who support it, but have criticisms or reservations. And there's people who want a second convention. And there's people who switch where they're at during that time. There's also kind of the rhetoric varies based on class. So you've got more of an elite anti-federalist, some more middling anti-federalists, and some more populist anti-federalists. And so I think that's really important to note. But there is a bit of a sort of cacophony or like a through line that comes through in these ideas. And I with my students, I tend to use Saul Cornell, who wrote the book, The Other Founders, to talk about sort of 9 ideas that united them. So I've listed them out here. Consolidation, I think, was the biggest concern. And in a way, it's an umbrella that can really overlook almost all the other concerns, which is the deep fear was that this was forming a national government that would eradicate the state governments, that representation itself was poor, that it was going to lead to aristocracy, that there was too much commingling between the branches going on, that the judicial branch would become tyrannical. There was no Bill of Rights, taxation, that the national government could tax in every and any way, and it would leave no room for states to tax, that a standing army would be the only solution to enforcing the law with a government so distant. And of course, the executive branch appeared to be both commingled with the Senate and also potentially monarchical because they could be elected indefinitely. So just, I put in here a few quotes that I think might be useful for folks, but I'm not going to read through all of them. But consolidation, I do think, is the most important. And then when we look at some of the other things like judicial tyranny, taxation, and a standing army, these were methods in which consolidation could actually happen. Representation, I love to read about. I love reading The Federal Farmer and Brutus about representation because they're making a dual point, I think, or maybe it's more than two. But one is that with such a small Congress, such a small national legislature, it's impossible to get all the voices, right? I've highlighted here the professionals, the merchants, the traders, the farmers. But also, so you're going to end up with a small kind of natural aristocracy that's going to be there. But also this idea that it would be unattractive for the middling folk to actually want to be a part of it. And then additionally, I think Brutus definitely makes the argument that it's completely impractical. It's not just we need to keep making it bigger and bigger. It's actually impractical. And therefore, what we should do is just bring the power back to the states. Aristocracy arguments, right? Was this going to be too small and therefore just lead to an elite oligarchy? Or were we going to get, as Sentinel says in his a little bit more populist rhetoric, an aristocratic junto between the president and the Senate? And, where were we going to see sort of the corruption grow? And then I think the most the argument that gets the most traction, certainly in the textbooks, is the absence of a Bill of Rights, and it certainly was low-hanging fruit. Immediately, you're going to get an argument that it's unnecessary, that it's potentially superfluous and absurd I believe it is what James Wilson said. But really, this is sort of a low-hanging fruit argument, whether it was needed or not. And I think you could actually dispute whether or not there needed to be a federal Bill of Rights. It was an easy concession, and that happened sort of in the course of the ratification debates. Okay, so I want to end with just saying, like, okay, where do we focus our attention? We have some ideas. These ideas get debated. Why is this important? And what should we talk about? So I think one of the things that becomes very clear as the document leaves Pennsylvania in September and heads out to the people is when Washington says to Henry Knox, you know, it really is going to depend on the people who can sell this. We absolutely have to get out there and write and support this and sell this to people. And so there's a rhetorical piece to this where we can really look with our students at how the rhetoric is being used. Additionally, the Anti-Federalists were adamant, right? We can approve this document, but we need a long, drawn out, very careful discussion of this. And the Federalists wanted to move, right? Urgency, and they wanted to move very quickly so that they could work on the momentum. And then lastly, I just think it's worth noting that just the ethos that each of these authors tries to build in their writing by tapping into ancient history and tapping into Montesquieu. Everybody wants to use Montesquieu to make it work for themselves, right? And they're building an ethos as to why they should be the one to be listened to. And there is something to be done there, I think, with students. The other thing to note is these are documents of propaganda to some extent, right? And depending on who they're aiming at different classes of people when they're actually speaking. And so you've got sort of aristocratically aimed and democratically aimed, and just even the way they're using those terms like aristocracy, democracy, and virtue mean very different things depending on who these papers or these speeches are aimed at. Another piece of this is it interesting to look at how often do these actually get paid attention to, reprinted, and circulated? According to historian John Kaminsky, between 1787 and 89, there are about 100 newspapers. They're split between the sections, but only 6 of them are anti-Federalist papers. And the anti-Federalist papers are not getting reprinted in the Federalist, publications. And so does that matter, right? If it does matter, then, Federalist One got the most, play out of the Federalist papers, or, Sentinel gets a lot of play, or Elbridge Gerry's complaints about the Constitution do. Not the Federalist papers we tend to pay the most attention to. The biggest thing and the last thing I want to end with is I do think that the course of events we can say is maybe the most important thing to tell if we want to say, how did we actually get the Constitution ratified? And if we begin in Pennsylvania, it doesn't look good for the spirit of debate in terms of what happens in Pennsylvania. The short story is they're kidnapping anti-Federalist members of the legislature in order to make sure that they can vote to set up the ratification convention. And the convention ends with a quote like this: "If the Constitution is adopted, I look upon the liberties of America as gone until they shall be recovered by arms." But as the ratification continues and we move from Pennsylvania, which is second, to Massachusetts, which is sixth, by the time we get to Massachusetts, even the anti-Federalist leaders, one we could say were anti-Federalist leaning, like the governor, John Hancock, have begun to accept that maybe they're choosing between union and no union. And maybe what they need to do is accept this document and apply amendments to it. And we also see people saying we can leave with a positive spirit. The same in Virginia, where Edmund Randolph, who Mason begins to call Little Arnold because he refuses to sign the Constitution, but then supports it in the debates, it says, like, this is the question we have to deal with. We either have to join or not join. And so the ratification debates, I think, give us a lot of windows into what we can look at and what we can understand about the ideas behind our country. And so I am recommending 3 of each that I think might be worth reading. And I'm going to flip through these and that you can go back and watch if you'd like to read these. But I think there are some anti-Federalist papers to read. There are some folks who don't fit into a neat box. And then there's also some Federalist papers. And I went out on a limb here, and I'm going to end by talking about Federalist 55, because I think this is a unique one. Maybe I might be the only person who would pick this as a readable paper. But I think something that really speaks to me right now is our ability to seek reason over passion, or at least control our passion with reason. And the end of Federalist 55 is something I always find fun to share with my students. In Madison, we think Madison, but Publius says that passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would have still been a mob. And I think one of the things that I get from reading these is while they were not above the fray, I think what happened in the conventions is that folks were willing to move on in a constitutional way, and they were willing to see people with whom they disagree as people with whom they disagree, without dehumanizing them most of the time, and without, thinking of them as less. And I think for me, I enjoy reading and thinking about these ideas, and maybe just they weren't above the fray, but maybe I just find someone else's fray to be interesting. But I think it can be really inspirational for us at this moment to take some time and think about the founding principles behind our government. And at that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to invite Tim Moore in. Hopefully I've intrigued you all a little bit to now have this wonderful panel.
Well, thank you, Kelley. It's very heartwarming to know that somebody is able to summarize the ratification debates in 20 minutes. That's fantastic. I do want to belabor 3 points that Kelley made. They're really important. And the fact that she mentions James Wilson as being a really important Federalist, I think a lot of time we do overemphasize the formal writings of Publius, but Wilson was huge in this, and he actually was the most vilified Federalist too. I appreciated Kelley's point about the Anti-Federalists being a nuanced group, the highbrow and the lowbrow, and everything between. And also the fact she pointed out this circulation problem that the Anti-Federalists had. It's really to our modern ears, that would be hard for us to imagine that it was stilted so heavily towards the Federalist side. So I think those 3 points were really, really important highlights of the presentation. I'm going to invite 3 really phenomenal teachers from various parts of the country: Chris Cavanaugh, Stacey Sklar, and Shayne Klein. If you'll pop in here. Chris is in the great state of North Dakota. Stacey's in California, and Shayne's in North Carolina. They're all have been associated with a civics program called the We the People program, and they're outstanding teachers in that program. I'd like to start out, maybe Chris, with this idea. Like today, everybody wants to claim this historical rootedness in the revolution or our founders, and it seems like everybody's grasping for originalism or something. Both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists claimed they're the true guardians of the revolution. In your estimation, can both or neither or only one legitimately make that claim?
Well, I think you have to identify first the principles of the revolution. I mean, what are those principles of the revolution? And I would say that probably would be liberty through limited government and sovereignty of the people. So I think we identify those. Who has a better argument to lay claim to the principles of the American Revolution? Both of them. I think was it Buddha said there's more than one way to the top of the mountain, something like that. I think both of them, both groups, and by the way, big shout out to James Wilson. Sorry, I got big James Wilson guy. Both believed in the same things. They just believed there were different ways to get there. And, I've heard from your boss, John Comiskey, John Patrick, and other scholars within our network, and they've talked about that. They wanted the same things, but you have to remember too, we're coming out of the American Revolution. And I would, for the listeners, I would have you go to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which is pretty important because it says we're free and independent states. So not only were we independent of Great Britain, but they were independent of each other. And they list about 5 powers that these states had. So you're coming through this whole concept of states being their countries. And so to get people to say, okay, we're giving up some of our sovereignty within the state of Massachusetts or Virginia, we're going to form this new thing. You can see that people wanting to hold on to it because we believe at the local level, we know what's best for us. And then, of course, the Federalist argument is like, well, listen, we're having problems. Or clearly having economic problems, as Kelley laid out. We need to have some stronger central government because what we have is not working, and our liberties will be in jeopardy if we don't strengthen that national government. So I would say both have claim to those principles. They just believe that there are different ways to get there. We do it at the local level, the state level, or do we do it at the national level?
Shayne, let's pick up on something that Kelley mentioned. She mentioned, a lot of the textbooks, they give the single paragraph tip of the hat to anti-federalists by, insisting on a Bill of Rights. The Federalists say we don't need one. It's dangerous. I'm asking you to weigh in on that. What do you personally think of that Federalist argument? We don't need a Bill of Rights.
All right. Well, I'm going to take the unnecessary part first. So, right, the Federalists say that the Bill of Rights is unnecessary, and I think they're right about that. Especially in the time they're writing, right? The states are probably a greater threat to individual rights than the national government is. The states have police power. They can pass laws to protect the health, safety, and welfare of citizens. They regulate all sorts of behavior. And so the idea that you need the states, almost every state constitution starts with a Bill of Rights or has a Bill of Rights in it. And that the idea that those are needed to protect you from state government makes sense. Remember, this is the time of most states have established churches. There's not really that much, there's some freedom of religion, but not a lot. And so I think the unnecessary claim has some credence. This fear of the states is, of course, what led James Madison, when he puts together, he's finally in Congress and they've submitted all these ideas for the Bill of Rights, and he finally gets Congress to say, okay, we're going to put this thing together and we're going to do it. He makes an amendment that limits states, right? He has like a precursor to the 14th Amendment. So Madison proposes an amendment that says, quote, no state shall violate the equal rights of conscience or the freedom of the press or trial by jury in criminal cases. And then the states don't ratify that amendment, right? Because they don't want limits on themselves. So I tend to believe the unnecessary argument. In terms of dangerous, I think that one's really interesting because the way in which our Supreme Court has tended to read the Bill of Rights, right? So the Federalists argue that one of the dangers of having a Bill of Rights is it will cause people to think about rights too narrowly, right? They won't give enough rights, and that the Constitution is not trying to take any rights away. And if you look at historically over time how the Supreme Court has interpreted the Bill of Rights, they tend to look for textual rights. They don't occasionally, yes, they'll stretch the text and find other rights, but that's not that common. And so I think the idea that the Bill of Rights actually limited our rights is a possible thing to believe.
Wow, I have to resist the urge. We could go on a long time about that, but thank you, Stacey. I'd like you to. I'm going to give you a definitional question because I mean, the devil's always in how we're defining terms. So some have suggested that maybe the essential fight between Federalists and Anti-Federalists was over the meaning of the word federalism. What do you, or is that too simplistic to lump it into a fight over a definition?
All right, I'm going to say yes and yes. So I think like at a certain level, yeah, of course, it's totally about federalism and the division of power between and among states and the federal government. But I also think that's a little bit like kind of defining it with a blunt instrument like a sledgehammer. I think there's also the nuanced version of it, which is like, what kind of life do we want to lead, and how do we envision that utopia that is being developed? Like, there's a lot of writings about, for example, Thomas Jefferson. I'm a big fan, but I know that's kind of controversial these days. But he had this vision of like the ideal pastoral life, and kind of the precursor to like a Brandeis, the right to be left alone in your sphere and manage on a more local level. There's that kind of life, and then there's the idea that we needed a more forceful federal government to be able to effectuate policy. There's like the tension between those two impulses, and where were the lines going to be drawn? So to the extent that that's all federalism, yes, but it's also a vision of a life.
Shayne, I would come back to you with this revolutionary era. I mean, we fought. Not everybody was united in the patriot cause. There were some divisions in the United States populace. Do you think that the fights, the argument, the discourse that Americans were having during the Revolution carry through into the Federalist and Anti-Federalist discourses and debates, or are they different than the Revolutionary era discourse?
I think they're a little different. I mean, I think, and this goes back to Chris's point about the free and independent states, right? Like during the time of the Revolution, there's really questions about, or the revolutionary period, right? Not the war itself, but the years as they're protesting, right? There's a lot of question about, are they going to be united? Are they going to really, take up the cause of each other? Are the other colonies going to back Massachusetts when the intolerable acts are passed? And so there's this revolutionary sort of conversation around how much they're willing to work together. And that I think you definitely see in the Federalist and Anti-Federalist writings, in the sense that the Federalists are very nervous about trusting each other, right? And they want government close to home. I was teaching the letters of John and Abigail Adams last week to my U.S. history students, and there's this part, Abigail is in
Did you mean Anti-Federalists were, I think you might.
Oh, sorry.
I think you might have been referencing the Anti-Federalists believed that in that localism.
Yes, I'm sorry. I got that wrong. Yes, Anti-Federalists believe in the localism. But you can, like, I was reading these John and Abigail letters, and Abigail's in Massachusetts and John is in Virginia, and she's asking him, like, can the Virginians defend anyone? How are the Virginians? Like, do you trust them? Basically, she doesn't use those words, but she's like, they have slavery and they're attached to this thing, and it's not about liberty. And how is it possible that we could be with them? So this idea of distrust and of lack of unity during the Revolution persists, and the Anti-Federalists are worried about union. They may ultimately want it, but they're very anxious about it, and they're very afraid of losing local control. I think you see that in a lot of the papers. The other way I looked at this was maybe a little different than you asked, but to think about the way in which the Federalists are so influenced by the lack of support for the Continental Army during the war, right? So people like John Marshall, people like Alexander Hamilton, people like Washington are really concerned that the Continental Congress didn't back them enough, didn't provide them enough supplies. How are they, this country isn't fully behind this. And so they want a strong government, a strong national government, a strong sense of union to kind of overcome some of those problems that they saw. So I guess to answer your question, I think that the topics that are of debate about governing functions during the Revolution are very much the topics of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Maybe less so the battle between or the discourse about what's going on with Britain. It's there, but I think they're concerned about these local things.
Chris, I want to ask a question about vagueness. A lot of the Anti-Federalists were a little concerned about some vague phrases. They saw red flags, and one of those was this necessary and proper clause. Could you briefly summarize the Federalist view of that clause and the Anti-Federalist view of that clause, and what say you?
To summarize the Federalist view, you guys are knuckleheads. The government has to have these powers, and I would go back to even Wilson, even before the Constitution, he's arguing for these basically implied or inherent powers under the Articles. And it's basically the same argument that Hamilton is going to make in Federalist 33. I think if you want to go to the primary argument for the Federalists to respond to this anti-federalist viewpoint is look at Fed 33 as Hamilton. He's like, well, of course, government should have the power for, we've listed all these things in Article 1, Section 8. Of course, they should have the power to carry these out. So don't worry your pretty little heads over it. It's a part of what government should be doing. If we're creating a government should have these powers to carry out these other powers. And which actually comes into play, really, it comes into play. Shayne mentioned our boy John Marshall. If you think about one of the early cases is about the national bank, McCulloch versus Maryland. And John Marshall will cite the necessary and proper clause and saying, and if, of course, you're going to have a national bank and the bank, you got to print money, you got to coin money, you got to store money. So we should have a bank. So, of course, there's that listed in Article 1, Section 8. So it's carrying out the powers. To fast forward to a more recent case over the Obamacare case from a few years back, Chief Justice John Roberts, in his opinions, cites John Marshall in McCulloch versus Maryland and uses the necessary and proper clause, calling it a taxing power. So, I mean, even though we look at the Constitution sometimes as this older, dusty document, it's still these arguments that we're talking about right now still come into play. The Anti-Federalists, though, oh my goodness. I could go down the list of people like in Brutus and Brutus 1, Brutus 11, Federalist Farmer number 4, Sentinel number 5, Old Whig number 2. These guys are losing their minds over it. But we got to add one more clause, and we've got to add the supremacy clause in Article 6, because in a lot of their writings, they're saying, well, look, you guys are who gets to decide what's necessary and proper? Congress does. And if this is going to be the supreme law of the land, what's going to happen to our state governments? You guys are going to run roughshod over us. And especially Old Whig number 2, he wants to bring in the word expressly, and he argues about in his writing. So we should put this word expressly in there, that because this is just these powers, because the necessary and proper clause, sometimes called the elastic clause, because the argument is that it will allow Congress to stretch its power, is at the end of Article 1, Section 8, which are all these enumerated powers. And not to get too nerded out on what happens at the convention, but, originally they don't list these enumerated powers. And it's not until it goes through the process, and back to my guy, James Wilson, finally through the committee of detail, comes up with this necessary and proper clause. And once they voted through it, they're good. But when it comes out, the Anti-Federalists are looking at that with the supremacy clause. They actually referred to it at times, called it the New Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act was something passed by Great Britain after they repealed the Stamp Act. And Great Britain, the Parliament said, yeah, we're repealing this, but hey, we reserve the right to do whatever we want because we're Parliament. So the Anti-Federalists are saying, well, look at this combination of the necessary and proper with the supremacy clause. And this is a new declaratory act. This new Congress is going to run roughshod over the states. And also, for one other fun thing to think about, too, is the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights, because power is reserved to the states. And if you read the language of the 10th Amendment, the word expressly is not in there, expressly delegated to the national government. And a lot of the folks, the Anti-Federalists, would like to have that. They try to get that in through the back door in the Bill of Rights to say, okay, to really limit the power of the national government. So that was definitely caused a lot of consternation on behalf of the Anti-Federalists.
Yeah, Stacey, as you know, and many people know, both of these a big issue for Americans at our founding was this idea of civic virtue. Which do you think? I'm asking a lot of opinion questions here. Which side do you think had a better understanding of public or civic virtue, or maybe neither. I don't know.
Yeah, I actually think, I mean, I would like to think that both sides were coming at this from a place of civic virtue. They just had different visions of how that would effectuate itself. While the Federalists perhaps saw themselves as stepping up and doing what needed to be done to be able to make this country work, right? Make it actually be able to function efficiently and well. The Anti-Federalists were no less virtuous, right, if you will. I mean, it's an important civic virtue also sometimes to force people to define their parameters, to protest, to resist, to engage in debate, to see, sometimes people don't see it as patriotic to be able to poke holes in an argument, or, maybe see it as cynical to see what can go wrong. But I feel like if you don't have that tension, that give and take, then you don't end up with as strong a final product. So the Anti-Federalists were equally virtuous, in my opinion. Kind of like if you look at the ancient Greeks, they saw the yin and the yang of all the different governmental forms. Maybe the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were coming at it from both sides, and in the end, it made it a stronger system than it would have been had it not faced similar opposition.
Yeah, Chris?
I'm sorry. I definitely agree with what Stacey was saying, but what I want everybody to understand too, and Kelley kind of alluded to this, we like to think of these guys as being virtuous, right? Which they were to a degree, but remember, they're also politicians, right? And it's about maintaining that power, depending on where that power is going to be. So were they virtuous? Yes. But were they self-interested? Yes.
Oh, sure. And you could have, while you could have the power hungry side of maybe the Federalists, you could also have the willingness to serve, or on the Anti-Federalist side, maybe you have the like just putting up obstacles side of it, but you could also have the necessary loyal opposition, if you will.
Let's turn in our second round. I thought it might be appropriate for us to fast forward into some presentism, which makes me a little nervous because I'm most comfortable back in the 1780s. But Shayne, I guess we often get a lot of questions like, hey, which party today is the Anti-Federalist? Which party today is the Federalist? Do you how would you respond to that? Are today's parties rooted in the Federalist, Anti-Federalist, or not?
I think I get that question a lot from students too, this idea of like, well, which is which? And they sort of expect a direct lineage that you can follow them through history, like the parties never change. And that, of course, is not what happens, right? And so, the ideas that emerge in these debates persist over time, right? There's been lots of references to ancient Greece and Rome and historical ideas about government, right? Humans have been struggling to think about how to create a well-ordered society that functions and serves people forever, for as long as there's been humans, right? So those are old questions. And I think we see the ideas of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists pop up at times in our political discourse. If we just take that simplistic idea of like a focus on national power versus, power located closer to the people at the states, I think that's the one that people tie to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, I think, correctly, but that are not consistent across parties and parties. I try to talk to students about the idea that, parties will be nationalist when they like the national government, and they'll want state power when they like their state government. And it depends on who's in power and what policies are currently in place at that time. And so I don't think that ideological consistency sort of stands over time.
Stacey, I've got to ask your opinion on this. Kind of a cynical view of the Federalist Papers is that I mean, Jamie's opening remarks is I think it was like the single most the best explanation of the meaning of the Constitution. Well, some have said these were just op-ed propaganda pieces. What say you? Should they be seen as just simple local New York op-ed pieces?
I actually find this to be a really interesting question, and I was I brought it up with
So do I. That's why I asked
with
it.
some of my students. And we were talking about it, and our consensus was absolutely they're propaganda pieces, but what's wrong with that, right? Like, why is it by definition a bad thing to be a propaganda piece? If you look at some of the World War II posters, you know, the Rosie the Riveter, I mean, those are propaganda pieces, but they have a positive effect. And so I think, I mean, I'm a fan of, obviously, of the Constitution, so I'm glad it was ratified. And if it served that end, is it by definition a bad thing that it was propaganda?
Well, then I guess a follow-up, I'll go to Chris on this one. If they're propaganda, uh, are have we overrated them? Um,
Yes, of course. And no, and no, we haven't. So from that regard, I would absolutely agree with Stacey. Propaganda is they're absolutely propaganda pieces, right? And as Kelley alluded to in her really great slideshow, these guys are writing furiously.
yeah.
They're writing furiously, and part of it, I've heard them described as really a debater's handbook for Virginia, because it might be too late to affect the convention in New York, but there might be writing as a debater's handbook because obviously Virginia was a very large state, very powerful state, very influential state. So perhaps writing with an eye what's happening down south of the convention there. Are they overrated? To a degree, but you know, it was Plato's Republic overrated? We still, you know, and if you think about what
Well, I
influences.
think many of us jump off the train there if we want to have to have a philosopher king, but
Well, but that is still my point. Is it's still very influential,
yeah.
right? And it may drive, you know, philosophy students crazy or wanting to scratch their own eyes out. But that writing is very influential and very important. The Federalist Papers, we put, you know, in the highbrow writings, that you use your terms, highbrow and lowbrow. And I would encourage folks to go out and look at the lowbrow, because lowbrow is like really like lowbrow, right?
Fun. It's fun. It's mudslinging, yeah.
Yeah, some serious trash talking going on, not like these highfalutin kind of ideas we see in Federalist and Anti-Federalist writings, but they're also extremely important to help us understand some of the ideas on both sides at the time in these debates over this new kind of government that they're hoping to get ratified, this new constitution. And I'm with Stacey. I'm a big fan too. I'm glad we got it taken care of. But to help us understand, you know, the debates. Now, Madison, of course, you know, he said if you want to understand the Constitution, first you got to read the words in the Constitution, and then you've got to go to the ratifying conventions before you look at the arguments that were out of doors at the time. But we rely on those Federalist and Anti-Federalist writings to help us understand the issues of the time. So it's really a deep dive into our founding philosophy. So I think that they're very important, but they're also, you know, we tend to think that these guys had all the answers, and they didn't.
Stacey, I'm often intrigued by this thought, and I'd like your opinion on this. You know, some said, you know, the Federalists won the fight, they won the battle, the initial, but the Anti-Federalists have been winning ever since. Is that oversimplistic, or what say you?
I totally disagree. I think the Federalists have continued to win over time. If you look at like the way the federal government has continued to grow and executive power has continued to expand, from the administrative state, military industrial complex, you know, executive power expansion. Post Dobbs, I guess, there's some powers being given back to the states, but I feel like situations like that are to some extent at the pleasure of the federal government through the Supreme Court, the executive. So I would say no. I don't see a way to view it through that lens.
I've got to shop that one around to Shayne and Chris. Maybe everybody's in agreement with Stacey there.
I think I don't. I think we haven't decided who's won yet. It's not over yet. I mean, it's ongoing, and I'm going to a word I learned from my friend Tim Moore way back in the day is sovereignty. And if you think about this whole idea of sovereignty, who's sovereign? Is it Parliament? Is it the King? Are these 13 colonial governments? Are these new state governments that won their independence? Is it going to be this new national government created by a constitution? And we still, I mean, we're still cussing and discussing over it today. As you know, Stacey brought up some very relevant issues that we're continuing to argue about. So stay tuned. I think the jury's still out on this one.
Shayne, what you went in on this?
Yeah, I was just going to agree with that last statement. I mean, I think that the 14th Amendment maybe says the federal government won, but if we peel back big chunks of the 14th Amendment, then maybe it's still up for debate. So I don't know, maybe with Chris on this one, but.
Well, Shayne, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what do you think some of the most common misconceptions are about anti-federalists?
Oops. So, of course, there's the anti part, right? So, you know, especially, you know, with students, you know, if they're just skimming the surface on this material, right, they're like, well, they're against, and that's true, but it implies that they're not really for anything, right? Which, of course, they're for the status quo, right? They're for some version of the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, with state sovereignty in place, and they continue to advocate for that as they propose these amendments. Most of the amendments they propose are trying to not be individual rights, but instead really to peel back federal power and to increase state power. Those are the ones that Madison does not put forward to the people or the states for ratification. And then the other misconception, I think, is that they're just about the Bill of Rights, which Kelley alluded to. And the idea that that's really, and that therefore they are huge proponents of individual rights. And I think that that's a problematic way to think about them too, because of what I mentioned when I was first sort of talking about, first question I got from you, which is that states throughout much of American history function as the primary suppressor of individual rights. So to link the Anti-Federalists and individual rights as that's what they were all about, I think is a pretty big misconception.
Chris, we're coming up against our allotted time, so Kelley made a full-throated vote for consolidation being the chief issue. If you had, do you agree with Kelley, or are there other basic complaint that is more important?
To keep it short, yeah, I completely agree with you. As a matter of fact, that one of the first words I wrote down was consolidated.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, I did too. I did too. Right.
Whenever you see you're reading the writings from this time period, when you see the word consolidation or national, those are dirty words. Those are anti-federalist writings. And so from there, and I think Kelley used the word umbrella, from there you venture off into these other arguments, whether it be the judiciary, whether it be the necessary and proper, or as Shayne talked about, the Bill of Rights. You go to these other things, but it's because it's a consolidation of power. Again, sovereignty. Who is going to be sovereign? Is it going to be the state level? It's going to be this national level. How is this going to be this shared federalism? You know, as Madison tries to explain in 39, how's that going to work out? So I absolutely agree. Consolidation is the umbrella.
Oh, this is to everybody. How do you think then that the Anti-Federalists get tagged with their basic uber principle is Bill of Rights? If Kelley and Chris are right, that it's really a consolidation is the basic issue, why do the Anti-Federalists get attributed as really, you know, banging the drum on rights?
Because that's what we get. I mean, it's the part they win, right? They get the Bill of Rights, even though it's not the Bill of Rights that most of them proposed.
Okay. All right. Stacey, your thought on that? Or?
I don't, you know, sometimes with that, I wonder if they threw that out there thinking they weren't going to get it, but that it would just derail everything. And then, you know, surprise.
Yeah, the second convention people certainly thought that. Definitely.
Well, and just to, I absolutely agree with what Shayne said, and Stacey. But you know, the reason we end up getting it is because there are three reasons Madison takes this project on. He called it a nauseous project. Think about that, folks. Our Bill of Rights, and this guy who's going to champion them calls it a nauseous project. One, he's worried about what Tim just said. He's worried about a second convention because, as Stacey said, this is their issue that people can coalesce around and drive this document back to a second convention immediately, which would strip it of all the power, right? So that he's been writing letters to Jefferson, and Jefferson's like, I like what you guys did, but I wish you had a Bill of Rights. And Matt's like, we don't need one. And Thomas is like, yeah, well, so they're back and forth, and you read these letters, and you can see Jefferson kind of he's kind of whittling away at Madison. And finally, Madison writes, I didn't say I was totally opposed to a Bill of Rights, right? And the third reason is more practical. He has to get elected because Patrick Henry is running his political machine in Virginia, and he keeps Madison out of the first Senate. And he gets a letter and says, hey, you better come back down here and campaign because your neighbor James Monroe is going to win that House seat. And so when he comes back down to Virginia to campaign, he makes a campaign promise. If you elect me, I'm going to champion the cause of the Bill of Rights. And so he's really kind of stealing the anti-federalist thunder there.
Well, we're straight up at the top of the hour. I guess this is where we turn it back over to Kelley or Jamie or John. I'm not sure who we hand it off to, but thanks, guys. This has been lively and enjoyable. I don't know, Jamie, if there's time for questions from participants or not, or how do you want to handle that?
Sure. No, we'd absolutely welcome any questions from the audience that you want to send to us in the chat box, and our folks at Pioneer can direct them to the panelists. Caitlin's telling me we have no other questions, but so no. First of all, I want to correct myself in my introduction. I did not note actually that Stacey's team from Amador Valley High School in California was the 2022 We the People champion. So I want to make sure I give her full credit for that and her team full credit for it, for the great work. But I want to just thank everyone, Tim, Kelley, all the panelists. Really, just wonderful job. Really great, engaging discussion about such a vital topics, and that it really shaped the whole history of the country and still are kind of with us today. And I think the thing that I'm really struck by when I listen to the We the People teachers and the panel today and the keynote from Kelley today is the really high quality of discourse and discussion and instruction and knowledge that these teachers have, these We the People teachers and lots of teachers have across the country, and how we need to continue to work hard to convey this to kids, to the general citizenry too, because as we know, the conversations these days are not what they could be. So really grateful for everyone taking the time to not only do the work that they do week in, week out, but also taking the time to share their work and their ideas and their knowledge with us. I want to do a little bit of a plug. Pioneer Institute has a weekly education podcast, The Learning Curve. This week, we've got an episode with an author on Abraham Lincoln. I think folks would enjoy. We have a lot of Pulitzer Prize winners and others on history and civics on a regular basis. And with that, I think that Caitlin has some sort of closing remarks and a few Pioneer events that are coming up in the coming weeks. But I just want to thank again Kelley for her excellent keynote, Tim and all the panelists for the great work, and really enjoyed the discussion.
Well, we did have a question come in about the Electoral College. Do we have time to address that or not?
Sure. No, we've got till about 3:15, so we definitely.
Wow. Okay. Well, the question
we got time to talk even more if folks want.
Sure. The question is the kind of the premise of the question is if federalism was this basic fight between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, is the compromises and the result of having an electoral college an example of federalism?
I think it is, but what I think is the problem for me, and I don't think
before we get to the problem, Stacey, how is it? And then now get to the problem.
I think it's constitutional to have an electoral college. It's obviously in there. But I guess my problem is the hamstringing of the members of the Electoral College having to mirror the votes of the state. I feel like the whole purpose behind it was to be a check. And if you are locked in that way, I don't feel like you're really fulfilling the purpose.
I think that some Federalists would use that creation, even though obviously we know it's not called the Electoral College in the document. They will use that creation of determining this new executive to try and qualm some fears that the Anti-Federalists would have that this new executive could be a Caesar. And the whole idea is like, well, no, there are ways that we're going to limit that power, and that will be because we're going to throw a bone to the states here and let you guys have some power in determining who your electors are and how they're able to vote.
And also, I think a piece of this also is there's a state role. You get your number of reps in the House, but there's also the state piece too for every state. So I think Michael, your question is a great question, because I think the bargains do reveal a federalism, a cooperation between national and local on that. I don't know, Kelley, Shayne, did you have other thoughts on this question as well?
There are two things that brought to mind that aren't necessarily, I mean, I do think it does show federalism. I think there's two things that I wonder, because I do a lot of asking questions and then I email Tim and ask him if there's any papers on it. But, my one thought I have is, it appointed the state legislatures to decide a manner for how the electors would be selected. And I wonder if there are any complaints about the fact that that wasn't a direct election by the people, even though that evolves to some extent. And the other question I have is just, or the other thing it brings up to me, another complaint, was the lack of the, Presidential Advisory Council. And just sort of thinking about, as I was reading through the papers that I read over the summer, just, again, this concern about the elitism, the potential monarchical nature of this, and whether what would have shown more federalism is if they did some type of a presidential council that was somehow appointed. Like, I think that's what the Anti-Federalists, or one of the things the Anti-Federalists really wanted, a form of federalism that would check the president, that would be better than that. So that's just what popped into my head without having the research behind it.
Well, there was a suggestion that governors should pick the national executive too, so that was floating around as well. So, if there are no more questions, I guess we'll turn it back over to the folks in charge.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Kelley, and all of our panelists, Chris, Shayne, and Stacey. It's been wonderful to hear from you. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in today. While we still have you for a minute, I do want to remind you all about the important work that we do and how that really is made possible by your support. So I want to just share a little bit more, if I could, about some of Pioneer's upcoming events. Tomorrow at the Pioneer office and available on Zoom, we will have a webinar and an in-person policy event on the state of housing in Massachusetts. Coming up soon, we'll have another virtual policy briefing just like this over Zoom about the MCAS exam and how that's being debated across Massachusetts coming up. The following day, we'll have another webinar brought to you by Pioneer Public Interest Law Center, our legal partner, and what all the work that they have done on home equity theft. And then coming up later in October, the Law Center will host their inaugural Brackett v. Deniston Rule of Law lecture, where we're going to host Paul Clement, who was our 43rd Solicitor General. He's going to be speaking about the ongoing debates that we've seen on our college campuses about free speech. So that'll be hosted here in Boston. And finally, on November 7th, the Pioneer Institute will host our annual dinner, the Peters Lecture, where we'll welcome Roland Fryer of Harvard, who will speak about how capitalism can drive social mobility. So I would encourage you all to join us for some of those events. And for any questions about that, you can contact me at cmarple@pioneerinstitute.org. And again, thank you all so much for joining us today.